Welcome, everyone. Good evening. Welcome back to another live stream. It is your host, Danny Dhaiphong. Please do hit that like button before we get started here as you come on. That helps boost the live stream in YouTube's algorithm. It is a special Wednesday evening live stream, and I'm pleased to announce monthly episodes now with my special guests. But before we get to him, we have entered a period of a ceasefire in Gaza. After more than a year of West Asia being plagued not just by genocide by the United States and Israel, but also regional war. Of course, nothing is fully set in stone. The United States and Israel are not trustworthy players, but now we are entering a period where the Ukraine conflict is going to be now up in question as Donald Trump enters office with promises to end this conflict too. Will this conflict actually end? What is all this talk about Vladimir Putin setting traps for NATO? What is the actual trap, and how will this conflict develop, and how will the multipolar world react to the geopolitical shockwaves that are currently underway? To talk about all of this, we have my returning guest, friend, colleague, geopolitical analyst, the host and curator and head journalist of the New Atlas, Brian Berletic. Brian, thanks so much for joining me this evening.
Thank you so much for having me back, and thank you everyone for tuning in.
Right. So please do, of course, hit that like button as we begin our conversation. But Brian, I did want to ask you, we're coming from one conflict supposedly ending in Gaza to another that has not yet ended, actually appears to be escalating as Donald Trump 2.0 comes into office. Now, I've been seeing headlines everywhere, including from resident neocon at Washington Post, Josh Rogan, talking about Vladimir Putin setting a trap for NATO in the United States. And I wanted to ask you, given my assessment, their assessment is that the trap is the negotiations, that Vladimir Putin wants to actually buy time to increase aggression and actually expand the conflict in Ukraine. My estimation is that the real trap is that Vladimir Putin and Russia have chosen a very particular way to fight the Ukraine conflict, and that this has actually set a big trap for NATO that is of its own doing. What is your opinion about all of this, given how the conflict is currently transpiring right now on the ground?
So in the Washington Post op-ed, Josh Rogan is talking about how what the United States should do instead of negotiating, because negotiating allows Russia to just continue doing what it's doing. And at this point, the same Washington Post that told us in the very beginning that Russia couldn't fight this war, they were losing it at every step of the way. Now they admit that what Russia right now is doing is dismantling Ukraine day by day as this conflict continues. So what he's suggesting, and it's not as if this is his idea, but this is what many want to continue to see happen, is that the U.S. should just send more military support to Ukraine. They should continue building up NATO's presence in Europe, and just continue with sanctions and everything else, just continue trying to raise the cost for this conflict, which is actually the entire point of this conflict. It's not to defend and save Ukraine. It's to extend Russia as much as possible. And so that is what we are seeing. And to a certain extent, it is extending Russia. Nobody can deny that Russia is spending huge amounts of resources, manpower, and equipment on this conflict. They are, to the extent that it has compromised their interests elsewhere, such as Syria, for example. And so what they see is just continue this process, continue stretching out Russia until something breaks. They're not sure if or when that will happen, but they feel like it's inevitable, so they should just continue doing this. They have to pretend that they care about Ukraine, they want to save Ukraine, even though they are prepared to literally, and they have even said it on multiple occasions, fight to the last Ukrainian, because they have no reason to stop until every last Ukrainian that will fight fights and dies. So this is kind of where we are. Russia is fighting this conflict from a point of view of attritional warfare. They have a military industrial output greater than the collective West, and they're using that leverage to simply grind down not just Ukraine's military, but also the military industrial stockpiles of the collective West. And I think they've done a good job doing that. They have put the United States and its proxies in a very difficult position because they're at a point now where they cannot fight in Ukraine through this proxy war, in the Middle East, and with China. They have to start picking and choosing where they want to commit, and wherever they commit, they're basically conceding these other areas. But I think we should talk more about that later, because even though they can't fight militarily against China, there's all kinds of things that they can still do that people have to be very careful about. A lot of people see this as in the bag. Russia's going to win. Multipolarism is going to prevail, but it really isn't quite there yet. It's still up in the air how this is going to end. So people have to be very careful and watch this very carefully.
Well, I think what we're seeing, Brian, is that this is a long war. And what's so interesting is what you're saying is, while Russia definitely has had to extend itself, the collective West is so overextended that the outright denial by people like Josh Rogan of the reality of the situation actually leads to the self-fulfilling prophecy of, they say Putin is setting a trap for the United States and NATO. Well, actually continuing this conflict and pushing Russia into a war of attrition, which works best for Russia, actually sets a trap for NATO.
Yes, basically. The one thing that I would warn people about, though, is that while this is consuming NATO's collective military power, the problem is the United States has many other tools that it uses that are extremely effective. I would say probably more effective than military power. We've watched this play out over and over again. This, Josh Rogan's pretending that this conflict began because Russia is an aggressor. This conflict began because the U.S. overthrew the internationally recognized government of Ukraine in 2014. They basically ended Ukraine's sovereignty and transformed it into a battering ram for the US and NATO. That is why this conflict started. And before that, there was no problem. Russia had no interest in changing the status quo with Ukraine. They were very happy with it being neutral and kind of in the middle and benefiting from both worlds. And to be honest, that was in Ukraine's best interests also. So we have to be very careful about that. Yes, U.S. NATO military power is diminishing relative to expanding military power around the globe across the multipolar world. Its military power does not go as far as it used to, but they still have this ability to infiltrate into the political and information space of a targeted country. And over time, over years, and we've talked about this many times, Danny, the National Endowment for Democracy, adjacent organizations, they build up parallel political movements and institutions that eventually displace the indigenous systems and circles of power in that targeted country to the point where the U.S. is able to politically capture a nation without ever having to use its military. It works very well for them, possibly better than using military force outright. And because many people don't even see it happening, it's happened so gradually, people don't even notice that it's happening. So it's perfect. And this continues. This continues vis-a-vis Russia, vis-a-vis Iran, vis-a-vis China, all along their periphery. This is happening. So we have to keep track of that. This conflict is, yes, a war of attrition. It is a battle of military industrial output, but there are other factors too. And if you look at, again, that Rand Corporation paper from 2019, Extending Russia, a proxy war against Russia and Ukraine is just one of several fronts the U.S. is pressuring Russia along. They said in the paper, Syria is another, Georgia is another, Armenia and Azerbaijan are another. The Baltic region is another. Central Asia is another. So they're putting pressure on Russia on all of these fronts. And Russia needs to defend against this pressure along all of these fronts, not just fight and win this proxy war in Ukraine. So there's a lot. Oh, someone in the comment section just said Greenland. Yes, Greenland, if you look at a map, it is right there in the Arctic, right there near Russia's northern route that Russia and China are developing to circumvent possible US blockades along other maritime routes. So this is a huge conflict taking place that extends far beyond Ukraine.
Yeah. Oh, indeed. And even just looking at the Ukraine conflict, though, it is this, it seems like interconnected phenomenon where you have this project of trying to extend Russia, trying to dismantle Russia through all along its what is considered its strategic interests, its sphere of influence. But then you also have the dynamic in Ukraine alone, where the more that they do this, the more that they attempt to do this, the more that they degrade themselves. Can you talk about how you believe the conflict in Ukraine will not only continue to do this to NATO and the United States, but also if they should expand? Do you see them giving up on Ukraine in 2025, the United States and NATO, and moving on toward another sphere of influence, another area of this periphery? Or will the United States and the foreign policy establishment attempt to do it all?
Well, right now they're attempting to do it all because I think from their point of view, they believe that possibly they can. And so this is the thing. This is what we have to take a look at, not just the conflict in Ukraine, but all of these factors together. Who can last longer? That is the question. That is where the actual determining factor is. Can the United States continue this proxy war in Ukraine while also continuing to put pressure along Russia's periphery, while also pursuing similar strategies against both Iran in West Asia and also China in Asia? And so it really is who is going to manage this and last longer. Russia has to manage its economy, all of these other crises the United States is creating for them. And it also interconnects with the similar conflicts both Iran and China are facing. And again, all of these other nations along their periphery that the US is targeting. Georgia, for example, this is a huge concern for Russia. Every single place the US succeeds elsewhere outside of Ukraine is going to enhance their ability to ultimately win the proxy war in Ukraine itself. So that this is what I'm saying. There's a lot of these extended factors that affect what is going on in Ukraine. I would say, though, that what you're saying, Danny, is that it's basically a trap. NATO has sucked themselves into this proxy war in Ukraine. And to a great extent, that is true. So we've seen the United States and Europe feed all of their air defense systems into Ukraine to the point where they have a critical shortage worldwide. And there's no way for them to fix this anytime soon. And as long as this conflict's going on and they're sending these air defense systems and interceptors to Ukraine, they are leaving themselves with a depleted supply worldwide. And we see this problem affecting conflicts elsewhere, such as with Israel and these missile exchanges they were having with Iran. We can see directly how this is going to affect them. And had Syria not been so hollowed out, if Syria was able to stand, if Russia had additional resources to help maintain Syrian sovereignty, that would have created a huge problem for Israel, a U.S. proxy there in the region. It still may be a problem for the U.S. in that region. We just don't know. But what we did see is an asymmetrical method the U.S. used to hollow out and eventually overrun Syria. And so the air defense systems, the interceptors turned out not to actually be an issue. And that is what the United States is trying to do here in Asia, also where I'm based. They're trying to do this not necessarily militarily. They're building up their military presence here. Air interceptors will be a huge problem here for the United States if they provoke a war with China. But at the same time, they're using asymmetrical political methods of politically capturing nations along China's periphery, turning them against China, and using that as pressure rather than perhaps just direct military pressure alone.
Yeah. And that was kind of where I was really wondering about, Brian, is this, you know, there's no doubt. I totally agree with you. There's no doubt that the United States, that NATO, that the foreign policy establishment that controls them wants to turn Ukraine into an Afghanistan situation for Russia. It wants to prolong this, and it wants to not just prolong it there, it wants to expand into these other areas that you've laid out to try to crush Russia. While at the same time this is happening, the United States is watching, and NATO, I feel like, are watching uh, their efforts actually fail in so many respects. Can you talk about that? Because Syria was a success, but it seems like Ukraine and some of these other areas that you mentioned have not turned out exactly how they have wanted them. And actually, it seems like Syria is just going to be in such chaos that might not actually turn out to be successful too in the long run. Your thoughts?
Well, I would argue that the United States wants Syria to be in disarray and in chaos. So their plan for Syria is not to build some sort of Western-style democracy or utopia there. They want it to be in chaos, just like what they did to Libya after they overthrew the government there in 2011. They basically turned it into a terrorist breeding ground, and then they exported terrorism across the region and around the world from Libya. All of these military bases we see Africa now expelling from their respective countries, French and US military bases, these were all basically bolstered and justified by the Western media to fight the terrorism the U.S. deliberately created by overthrowing Libya and turning it into a breeding ground and exporting militants and arms across the rest of the region. And so they're going to do the exact same thing in Syria. This is actually what they have already been doing in Syria, in the areas that they occupied, building up extremists, militants, arming them, funding them, training them until they reached critical mass. They were able to overthrow remember, up until they succeeded in Syria, Syria looked like a huge failure for the collective West also. We're not there in Syria. We weren't taking inventory of the Syrian military. We just assumed that Russia and Syria would do everything that they could to maintain what they had fought so hard to achieve there in stopping the U.S. proxy war, stop the U.S. regime change operation there. But again, eventually they succeeded. So this demonstrates that despite the shift of global power to multipolarism, a better balance of power between nations instead of the U.S. imposing itself on all other nations, despite that, there are limitations that nations like Russia, Iran, and China have. They cannot do. People always say, why didn't China send troops to Syria? They literally have no physical way to project military power like that to Syria. People take for granted what the U.S. could do. Any nation with a large military can do. It simply isn't true. So there's a lot of factors here. What could look like a complete disaster for the United States over time could end up as a success, just like in Syria. But let's go back and look at Libya, though. That was an instant where in 2011, Russia could not do anything to intervene or help Libya. But now Russia is very active in Libya. And the United States is having a very hard time imposing its will on Libya and using it the way that it wants. I just mentioned how across Africa now, these nations are expelling U.S. and French bases. So this is a shift there in the region, positive for multipolarism and a bit of a disaster for the U.S. and its European proxies. So it's hard to tell exactly how it's going to unfold over time. We have to be very careful not to draw conclusions on ongoing conflicts or conflicts that haven't been fully resolved. We have to really be careful about what we assume in terms of how weak or strong the collective West is versus the multipolar world is, unless we know for sure. I think Syria should be a cautionary tale regarding that.
Yeah, and so that gets the question is, why would someone like Josh Rogan and a lot of the collective West, Donald Trump is coming into the presidency of the United States. touting negotiations. He's going to be bragging about the Gaza ceasefire, and he's going to use that momentum to attempt to negotiate Ukraine. But everyone in the foreign policy establishment, people like Josh Rogan, these neocons, are saying absolutely not. That is a trap that Putin is setting for you. Why would they want to continue if there's so many problems that this conflict, even from just the level of looking at this as a forever war, that it's causing for both NATO, the United States, especially Europe? Why would they want to continue it?
Well, they want to continue it because even though they're not going to admit it, they want to use Ukraine to the fullest extent to exhaust Russia. And so, again, they have to pretend they care about Ukrainian lives. They want to see Ukraine's sovereignty preserved, but they literally couldn't care less what happens to Ukraine. They want to completely use it, and that's it. And they want to keep this going for as long as possible. And they don't care how bad it looks or how Ukraine is deteriorating, how many troops are dying, the fact that entire brigades are unraveling now, even according to the Western media. So there's that. Another thing, and Danny, this was something we were talking about right before the show. We were talking about how someone like President-elect Donald Trump, he's talking about these wars before he steps foot into office because they're Biden's wars. But once he's in office and it's his war, he's going to turn 180 degrees around, because that's exactly what he did during his first term when he inherited all the wars, conflicts, regime change operations from the Obama administration. And we all remember President Obama, right before he got into office, this is his first term, he was condemning all of the wars that President Bush was running and attempting to provoke. And when it was his war, despite that Nobel Peace Prize, he decided he was going to double down on all of them and start all of the wars that President Bush was unable to get to during his term in office. So a lot of this is just political theater to continue stringing along, not just the Western public, but a lot of the world. You'd be surprised how naive some people in high levels of government are outside of the collective West. They'll get their news from the BBC and CNN. They will honestly ask people, do you think it's going to make any difference now that Trump is in office or that Biden is in office? And no matter how many times you tell them, it will make absolutely no difference, because they are buying into these narratives, this political theater. They still, at the back of their mind, think that big change is coming, and then it never does. And they don't make the decisions necessary to defend themselves, their country, their future against what is continuity of agenda, unchanging, unapologetic continuity of agenda. And you see a lot of people right now, even before Trump enters office, he's already backtracking and pivoting away from things that he was promising or people assumed he was going to do. This talk about Greenland and the Panama Canal, I mean, you're just talking about more foreign adventures to expand U.S. Power and influence abroad rather than America first. As you see people twisting themselves into pretzels trying to explain why he's doing this, the easy answer is it's continuity of agenda. And so a lot of what we're seeing right now isn't a serious attempt by Trump to end the conflict in Ukraine. It's political theater to convince you that there is some sort of process here, and it's not just going to continue uninterrupted.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's quite obvious that regardless of how you spin it, this whole idea of Donald Trump as a peace president, whether it's the Gaza ceasefire where he's already nudging Israel, hey, do whatever you want after it's been signed. I mean, come on, Israel and the United States, a piece of paper, how much is that really worth? The same with Ukraine. You know, there's they're talking at the same time, Brian, as they're saying they're going to enter into negotiations with Russia. They're saying, Ukraine, lower your conscription age. Well, why would they lower their conscription age if there's going to be negotiations to end a conflict? Just means you want them to fight for a longer period of time. That's not generally the behavior of someone who believes or even wants to settle a conflict in any period of time. And then, you know, it goes from 100 days. They're talking about 6 months. It seems like, exactly as you said, that there is this continuity of agenda at work, and it's more about the political save face.
I think the 100 days is really, they designate 100 days because this is the amount of time they think the American people need to forget everything that they were just complaining about the Biden administration doing before they themselves start doing it. And they just hope and they're right. The collective memory of the public will completely forget that this was all being done under Biden when Trump starts to do it. And then instead of condemning Trump for betraying his campaign promises, they'll start making excuses. We watched this happen for 4 straight years while he was in office the first time. And the excuses people make for President Trump, a grown adult who has all kinds of connections, all kinds of resources, have the absolute best advisors around him, someone who should know how to hire good advisors. People saying, well, maybe he didn't know. Maybe he didn't know who Mike Pompeo was. Maybe he didn't know who John Bolton was. And then he's hiring the exact same type of people, if not exactly the same type of people, like Elbridge Colby, for example. And he's just going to do it again. And because people can't, people have a hard time accepting the truth because the truth is very uncomfortable, always. It's very uncomfortable, and people have a hard time, and I understand this, and I used to be like this too when I was younger. They don't want to face the truth that there is no way to vote yourself out of this problem. I don't know what the solution is, but it isn't voting in presidential elections. That is not how you're going to change things in America.
Well, even Trump's, and final word on this, because I want to move on to a different arena of the geopolitical space, but even people like Tulsi Gabbard, who a lot of people were high on. I've been down on Tulsi Gabbard ever since she essentially came out in favor of the genocide in Gaza. But she, when paraded in front of the Foreign Intelligence Committee, even she is walking back her stances already before nomination, just to get nominated, around things like privacy and the FISA courts and the Patriot Act and all of that is going out the window once if she becomes Donald Trump's director of intelligence. So all that is to say is, yes, we are in for, I think, a very bumpy ride under Donald Trump, which will be characterized a lot, not by peace, but by the U.S. Moving forward as it can, projecting, regardless if it's overextended or not, it's going to be moving toward more of that agenda of full spectrum dominance. But Brian, I wanted to ask you now about, speaking of forgetting, for many people in the United States and in the NATO sphere, there might be a bit of forgetting about what's actually happening on the battlefield in Ukraine. Could you talk about where things are going in the battlefield of Ukraine? Because when we talk about the aversion that NATO has to negotiations, what's so interesting is that it isn't so clear how long Ukraine can really keep going. And no matter if they extend elsewhere, it would be a pretty big deal if Ukraine ended up in a situation of full defeat. Where is the situation on the battlefield for Ukraine and Russia?
That's a really good point, Danny. And this is the reason why we're hearing about negotiations. What Trump and what the special interests he and the Biden administration represent, what they want to do is freeze the conflict, because just as you said, things are getting very bad on the battlefield, and I'll describe that in just a moment. But what they're worried about is a complete collapse of Ukraine's fighting capacity, which means then Russia will be able to advance across any territory they want to seize. There really would be no limit at that point to what they would be able to achieve in Ukraine. So unless there is some sort of freeze on the conflict or some sort of Western military force occupying a buffer zone, and then Russia is faced with the prospect of fighting a war directly with NATO. And this is exactly how the U.S. froze the conflict in Syria, by the way, and we see how that played out. This is why they're talking about it. It's not because President-elect Trump is the peace candidate and he doesn't like to see the war. He doesn't have the stomach to watch people die for no reason. He has plenty stomach for that. That's what he did all during his first term. That's whatever U.S. president in recent memory has done during their presidencies. No, it's because they need to freeze this conflict because things are bleak on the battlefield. So what is happening on the battlefield? Just as we have been talking about all along, this was a war of attrition. Russia is slowly, steadily grinding down Ukraine's manpower, their equipment, their ammunition, their infrastructure, military infrastructure, general use infrastructure that supports the military industrial output of Ukraine, what remains of it. And in recent weeks or maybe months, we've watched entire brigades. So a brigade is about 4,000 men strong, and a brigade is broken down into many subunits, and they're supposed to fight usually in a cohesive way on the battlefield, but they're unable to because the original brigades that the US and NATO stood up between 2014 and 2022, all of those brigades have been mauled and depleted and unraveled. And so what they've been trying to do since then, and they did this before the 2023 offensive, the big Ukrainian offensive, they started building new brigades. But you cannot build a military unit 4,000 men strong with all the subunits and proper experienced leadership at every level. You cannot do that in half a year. It's impossible. It could actually take between 2 to 3 years to stand up a brigade properly. So what we're now watching are these hastily slapped together brigades, including one that was sent to, at least half of it was sent to France to train and be equipped and sent back. We're watching them unravel even before they get into the fight. And then once they get into the fight, it's done for them. And what they end up doing is chopping up whatever is left of the brigade and sending it to other steadily dying and depleted brigades to try to bolster their numbers and their amount of ammunition and equipment. So it is obvious that there is a slow motion collapse taking place with Ukraine. We remember for the longest time, if you follow the day-to-day line of contact, where it is, we remember weeks, months would go by and the line wouldn't change. And the fighting was continuous. Now, every single day, the line is changing in favor of Russia. They are making advances in heavily fortified areas that didn't move since the fighting started in 2014. Now the line is finally moving because Ukraine simply does not have enough manpower, equipment, and ammunition, and it is physically impossible for the collective West to train more manpower and to send any more ammunition, equipment, and weapons than they already are sending to Ukraine. And we were talking earlier, Danny, about military, industrial capacity and stockpiles being depleted. So things like artillery shells have been depleted. There are no significant stockpiles left that the West has to spare. They may have stockpiles, but they cannot spare it on Ukraine. So they're sending monthly production, what a percentage of it, every month to Ukraine. The Department of Defense will post these arms packages for Ukraine. And if you look at them every single month, you will notice it's the exact same items every single month. They don't have sufficient numbers to send Ukraine what they need. They send a percentage of monthly production, which is very small, to Ukraine because that's all that they have to spare. And so it is a unsustainable process that you can see manifesting itself on the battlefield with Russia moving forward in heavily fortified areas that for the last 3 years they were unable to advance. Now they are advancing. They're sweeping across Chasiv Yar, that is west of Bakhmut, and we remember them taking Bakhmut. And from Avdiivka, which was one of the most heavily fortified Ukrainian positions in the entire conflict, they took that, and now they've moved up to Pokrovsk. And they're encircling Pokrovsk. And so we see this process happening faster and faster, almost day by day now. It is accelerating. It's not just a linear process of Russia moving across the battlefield. You'll see a lot of pro-Ukrainian commentators say, at this pace, a snail is actually able to move faster than the Russian military. But when they were saying that, and to where we are now, it's actually accelerating, moving faster and faster. So this is not just unraveling; it's unraveling exponentially. This is why we hear about negotiations, because they need to freeze it so it doesn't collapse altogether.
Yeah, and 2024, Russia accelerated its pace of advance dramatically so much so that in the last few months alone, I think the reports were that they were taking several square kilometers per day, every single day, which has exactly led to the situation that you just outlined. Talk about Pokrovsk, though. Why is it important? Why I've been hearing reports too that the Ukrainian lines around Pokrovsk are leaving without a fight. That they're not that it's so dire that they're the soldiers there, the troops, the Ukrainian army, they're just dropping and leaving.
Yes, well, Pokrovsk is one of the heavily fortified positions Ukraine is still maintaining. They have several others along the line of contact that they've been holding onto. Kupiansk in eastern Kharkov region, that is another one. The fact that they're unable to hold it, despite it being so important and so heavily fortified, tells you a lot about the health or lack of health of Ukraine's fighting forces. And you're absolutely right. These forces are starting to fall back with less and less fighting. They're surrendering in greater numbers. And again, this was what we have been talking about for the last 3 years. This is a war of attrition. Russia is not trying to roll over Ukraine in 3 days like we always hear. They prepared for years for a war of attrition. You cannot fight a war of attrition like this without preparing for it. As you see, the collective West cannot fight and win a war of attrition like this without preparing years in advance to do so. And they didn't prepare, which is why they're unable to fight a war of attrition like this. Russia prepared years in advance to do this. They hoped, even if it was a small probability of success, that they could steamroll over Ukraine and shock them into a short war. But they were prepared to fight a long war, which is what they are now doing. And this is the impact it has. Day by day, month by month, year by year, you're hollowing out this huge military backed by the summation of NATO power. That is what we're seeing. And we're seeing it finally beginning to unravel. When is it going to collapse? I don't know. How is it going to collapse? I don't know. You can't tell for sure unless you know the exact disposition of troops on both sides. But we can see this is a process in the making.
Yeah, well, according to Nikolai Patrushev, Putin's top aide, he says it's very likely this could happen in 2025 if the current situation continues. What do you make of that? Do you see that as a possibility given Russia's acceleration in 2024? Do you believe Russia might accelerate in 2025 if all of this bluster about Trump and negotiations and all of that is to fall through?
I mean, it's always hard to predict the future. I would say this year we should be looking out for active attempts by the collective West to set up some kind of buffer zone or some sort of force they send into Ukraine. I think we should keep an eye out for that. Josh Rogan in his Washington Post op-ed is saying, send more weapons. If there were more weapons to send to Ukraine, they would have sent them already. They don't have more weapons to send to Ukraine. There's nothing left to spare to send to Ukraine. And the way it works is not an episode of G.I. Joe where all of the Joes know how to use every type of weapon. They grab on a Cobra tank and they can just drive that also. In real life, it takes years to become effective at operating advanced weaponry like tanks, aircraft, helicopters, even different types of weapons themselves take time to become proficient on. And it's not just one guy learning how to do it. Oftentimes you need a crew to coordinate together to operate this equipment. And then you also have to train different crews to work together collectively as a unit. And then beyond that also, and that this is what I've been trying to point out when they talk about building new brigades in Ukraine. People don't understand how complicated that is. It's not something you could just do overnight. It takes years under ideal conditions. Ukraine is trying to do it under obviously less than ideal conditions. So this year, I would say look out for the buffer zone. They've been talking about it for a long time. In many ways, they've been setting it up and preparing under the guise of many different pretexts. We remember them talking about what if Russia invades another nation in Europe? We need to have all these supply lines for the United States to move in huge amounts of equipment and troops. They're setting that up for the buffer zone. That's what they're setting that up for. All of these efforts to squeeze more out of NATO, out of Europe, to create some sort of collective force that they could use in Ukraine. That is all happening right now. When and how they're going to finally execute it, I don't know. I think you have to also understand when people talk about negotiations, whether it's the US or Russia, a lot of that is also theater. Russia knows they can't negotiate with the collective West. We know they've tried. We've watched the outcome of that over many, many years. We watched the US unilaterally walk away from multiple arms control treaties. We watched them blatantly, admittedly, use the Minsk agreements to just buy time to arm Ukraine. We just watched what they did in Syria. So Russia knows they can't negotiate, but they still have to make it look like they're trying, or at least maintain good faith on their side, just for the sake of their image globally and their ability to invest in this alternate global system that they're trying to build. You can't just say, no, we're not going to negotiate. We're not open to negotiation. Of course, they have to say that, but they know there's nothing they can negotiate with the US or NATO in good. There's nothing that they can negotiate where there will be good faith. So we have to keep an eye out for that. As far as Ukraine collapsing this year, I don't know, because people have to remember, they try to compare it to Iraq or something like that. Ukraine is bigger than Iraq geographically in terms of population. Their military was much larger. If they were not subjected to sanctions, they have the West pumping it full of weapons and money and political support. It's a completely different situation. There's no way to tell for sure.
Also, they have, people call us Putin this, Russia that, you're working for them. It's just a fact that they have Russia, which isn't actually trying to destroy all of Ukraine. What happened to Iraq was they were entirely destroyed. It was shock and awe. That's the term that was used during the U.S. invasion. Russia is not doing shock and awe. And actually, when Patrushev and Putin, when they're warning NATO about this collapse, when they're saying this isn't going to go well, the warning isn't we're going to just blow everything away and it's game over. No, because they understand you do that, well, now you're entering into a potential nuclear configuration with NATO. I think it's more so about the fact that they're saying if you stop this will actually work out best for everybody involved. This is not going to end well for any of us. And I think Russia understands that they are in a much better position to, if things currently are going the way they're going, to ride this out way more than Ukraine or their NATO backers.
Absolutely. Logically, objectively, ending this conflict. NATO shouldn't even exist at this point. Expanding toward Russia, encircling, containing Russia, Iran, China. None of this is in the best interest of anyone on the planet, including the collective West. It's in the best interest of a very tiny, tiny percentage of special interests across the collective West. And even for them, when you really think about it, long term, it isn't actually in their best interest, but they cannot see it. And what they're doing is simply caving into their own human nature, their greed, their desire for perpetual money and power, almost like a virus. I mean, a virus ravages its host until its host dies, and then the virus will inevitably die with it unless it spreads somewhere else. And once you run out of hosts, the game's over for you. And that is a lot like how these special interests across the West operate. And that, like, they can't even see that it's not benefiting them. They cannot see it. And we've seen this all throughout empire, throughout human history, just this unsustainable expansion until they overreach and collapse. And so that's kind of what we're seeing right now. And they always think that there's a way that they can somehow save it. And maybe they're convinced now that there's some way they can save this, that they just push a little harder. All of these nations that are starting to rise up and move out from under their shadow, somehow they can reassert control over them. This is basically what they openly talk about in their policy papers and even in op-eds, actually. So yes, it's not in their best interest, but they're going to continue doing it. Russia China, Iran, and many of the nations joining this growing multipolar world, they're starting to see it. But again, what I always try to warn people about is, even though something obviously serves someone's best interests, they can be convinced to pursue something that is not in their best interest. Just look at Ukraine itself. The US, through its ability to politically capture and influence the population of Ukraine, has convinced them to commit collective national suicide. And that is what they're doing right now. And they're in the process of convincing other countries around the world to do the same thing. Look at the Philippines. They've convinced the Philippines to stop building projects together with China, desperately needed modern infrastructure that the Philippines lacks, and instead build military bases to host US troops and to buy US missiles to point at their largest trade partner, China. And they're even doing it inside China itself, on the island province of Taiwan. They're trying to convince the people there to likewise, just like Ukraine, commit collective suicide. So you're right, Danny. It's objectively not good for anybody what is going on, but these special interests don't see it that way, and they've convinced many other people not to see it that way.
Right, right. But the interesting thing is, while Russia frames it as this is not going well for all of us, Russia will also can say that, in fact, there have been benefits to the conflict in Ukraine for Russia. Russia has rapidly industrialized its military. It's created economic pathways that maybe it wouldn't have been able to create without this conflict. Could you talk about this paradox? Because on the one hand, we don't know how, if this is a forever war, we don't know how this will go for Russia. Of course, we can't predict the future. But in the here and now, Russia can say that a lot of this conflict, well, too many people have died. There's nothing to glorify about war. Russia has ended up turning out all right from this in many different respects. Could you talk about some of those?
Yes. Well, if Russia doesn't eventually collapse, if the US does not succeed in overextending it and collapsing it, then you're absolutely right. This has allowed Russia to do things under normal conditions it would not have been able to do. And this is in terms of decoupling itself from this US-led unipolar world order, basically a global dictatorship that every nation, to one degree or another, is locked into, including Russia, including Iran and China. They're all locked into it to a certain degree or another. And so this conflict, and because of the West's hostility towards Russia, has allowed Russia to justify doing things that it wouldn't be able to sell to the public otherwise, in terms of establishing economic self-sufficiency, expanding industry by leaps and bounds and through methods that it wouldn't have been able to do under normal, say, market economics and influences. Create alternatives for Western-dominated financial systems, which is something Russia isn't just doing by itself. It's doing together with all these other nations the U.S. is trying to target, encircle, contain, isolate, divide, and destroy. And so the U.S. is forcing these nations to create these alternatives that they normally would not have tried to pursue. We always hear about de-dollarization. None of these nations woke up one day and said, you know what, I'm sick of the dollar. Let's do de-dollarization. The U.S. forced them to do it. And even this is a process that's been going on for years and years. They've tried to do everything within their power to avoid having to do this, because they know how painful and long-term it's going to be to pivot away from the dollar. But the U.S. has given them no choice. It's forcing them to do it. If it's successful, this will be the ultimate self-made self-destruction of an empire, forcing these nations to create an alternative global empire and eventually isolate the United States itself by default, not because they actively are trying to, but just because they've created an alternative and they have to exclude the U.S. because the U.S. isn't interested in being part of it. So I think that is a huge possibility, and I think it's something that is playing out. The question is, can the U.S. do anything to derail it or disrupt it? And I would warn that, yes, there's a lot of things they can do. You hear all about the United States, and this has been for years, talking about blockading Chinese maritime shipping worldwide. And people point out, well, that would destroy the global economy, including the economies across the West. From Washington, Wall Street, London, and Brussels' point of view, this is a lot like chemotherapy. You poison your whole body to try to kill the cancer before you kill your whole body itself. And from their point of view, that's how they see this whole process. They're going to try to destroy the entire planet to kill off multipolarism without completely killing themselves, even if it ravages them, sickens them, depletes them. They just hope the final outcome is we get rid of multipolarism and then we could rebuild our unipolar world order. People have to be very careful about that because they're openly laying the plans for that. We're watching them destroy Ukraine down to the last brick and individual. They have openly stated their plan for Taiwan is not to defend Taiwan from the rest of China. It is, I see someone in the comments section beat me to it, scorched earth policy. It's not that they're going to scorch earth China to defend Taiwan. They're going to scorch earth Taiwan so that there's absolutely nothing left and to raise the price as high as possible for reunification with the rest of China. This is how they're thinking. These are how their policies work. This is why when people see Russia, China, Iran being so cautious and patient, it drives them crazy. But that's because these countries know that there really is no limit to what the U.S. will do to try to save its empire. So we have to keep that in mind. We're not dealing with someone who is rational and who is necessarily thinking about even their own self-preservation at this point.
Yeah, no, I mean those are all very astute points, Brian. Before we move on, I wanted to just ask you about what have you made of these, or maybe you can assess in this context because I think it proves your point here. Ukraine, as we close out the Biden administration into the Trump administration, has been firing every attack, every storm shadow that it has into Russia. Russia has responded in kind, once with the Attrition, but mostly just continuing to hit Kiev's power grids. That seems to be happening almost every other day, degrading the ability of the Ukrainian military to use that power grid for their purposes. Talk about what you've made of this in this context, because in reality, it's such a dangerous escalation, but in practice, there seems to be a very patient Russia looking at this from maybe a different perspective than maybe how we see it, which is, long-range missiles. That's moving toward a direct confrontation and possibly the end game of nuclear annihilation.
It is a huge provocation, and it is tremendously risky. But the reason why Russia is being so patient is because if you actually look at the impact that these missiles have, a lot of them are intercepted. The ones that do reach their target, they do damage. They do damage. They're hitting with their long-range drones. They're hitting oil depots, other targets. They cause damage. They're destroying some things. But if you were to add up Russia's infrastructure and military-industrial base, it is so massive that these strikes have virtually no impact at all on what's going on. If you look at the number of missiles and drones that Russia has used on Ukraine, which is much smaller, and all of its infrastructure and industry is much more concentrated in terms of area, even with this massive, endless barrage, Ukraine is still able to at least do a little bit in terms of military industrial output. Obviously not enough, but the fact that it still exists and continues shows how hard it is in reality, separate from Hollywood movies and how that always plays out. In reality, it's very hard to completely destroy industrial infrastructure and things like this. It's very hard to do it in real life, in practice. And Russia has such a tremendous advantage in terms of the number and the capability of its missiles and drones, and yet they're still not able to erase all of these aspects of Ukraine's fighting capacity. Ukraine, with its limited amount of missiles in terms of quantity and quality, will never even come close to doing this to Russia. And so while it is politically provocative and outrageous when you really think about it, and extremely dangerous and reckless. In terms of the strategic outcome of this conflict, it really makes no difference. This is why they're being patient. Again, Russia thinks long-term. China thinks long-term. They don't have this need like the West does to maintain this image of invincibility and impunity. They are able to take the hits and roll with them and keep their minds and eye focused on the future. Sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't, but they're always thinking long term.
I wanted to actually play you something, Brian. It's from NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. He had this to say, and it's an interesting video because it talks about the different way that, let's say, Ursula von der Leyen was talking about Russia in 2023 versus how Mark Rutte is talking about Russia in 2025. And it kind of underscores this paradox of, Russia's rise and its strength during this Ukraine conflict building, while at the same time, there's this narrative that they've tried to construct about Russia being very weak and desperate. Here we go.
Russia's financial sector is on life support. We have cut off 3/4 of Russia's banking sector from international markets. Nearly 1,000 international companies have left the country. The production of cars fell by 75% compared to last year. Aeroflot is grounding planes because there are no more spare parts. The Russian military is taking chips from dishwashers and refrigerators to fix their military hardware because there are no semiconductors anymore. Russia's industry is in tatters.
The 2% we are now is absolutely not enough. When you look what Russia is producing now in 3 months, is what the whole of NATO is producing from Los Angeles up to Ankara in a full year.
So quite the change. And so I want your take on this, given how not only the Ukraine conflict has changed, but how Russia has changed through it, and of course, this developing multipolar world.
Well, of course, everything van der Leyen was saying was completely untrue, and I've even heard hardcore pro-Ukrainian commentators, analysts from the West say, no, Russia was not doing that. You don't take chips from dishwashers and put them into missiles. It doesn't even make sense. And so it wasn't even true when she said it. But at the time, many people didn't really seem to know that. So they were taking advantage of people's ignorance. The situation on the battlefield wasn't manifesting itself in such an obvious way to make it clear. But I just want to point something out. People say, well, Brian, you've been right about Ukraine all along. But if you look at the sources that I'm using entirely Western sources, often sources from the US, or some European government itself, from the Ukrainian government itself, from Western analysts who are definitely unswervingly pro-NATO, pro-Ukraine. All along, the map that I show people in my updates is always a pro-Ukrainian map. I don't show any Russian or pro-Russian maps or sources, because I feel like if you're following those sources, you already more or less know what I'm going to tell. I'm trying to convince people that buy into Western propaganda. I'm trying to show how, even if you pay close attention, filter through the propaganda, even they, at the very beginning, were talking about deficiencies in Western military industrial output. The fact that Russia is actually producing a lot more equipment and ammunition than the narrative suggested, that outlook that van der Leyen was portraying. It was something that, even if you look through the Western media at that time, they were contradicting with actual facts, or the closest thing you can find that was a fact. And now what they're doing is they have to admit it, because you can't keep talking like van der Leyen when entire cities are falling to Russian forces. The Ukrainians are talking about opening investigations into entire brigades that unraveled and deserted. You can't keep talking about Russia collapsing when the only thing that we can see is Ukraine collapsing. So it's more perception management. They've tried to hold it off for as long as possible, admitting what is really going on in Ukraine. There's no way to cover it up or spin it. And you can see online, if you enjoy suffering and you go on X and you look at the hardcore pro-Ukrainian spheres of information on X, there are diehards who are still every day, Ukraine is winning, Russia is losing, Russia isn't able to do anything. Every tank they put on the battlefield, Ukraine is eliminating. They show all these videos and everything. But even their followers are starting to question them and say, we're just kind of tired of pretending that Ukraine is winning. They're obviously not winning. So that's where we are right now. You're right, Danny. It's a huge transformation in terms of narrative. But I think the collective West knew this all along. I don't know. It's always hard to tell. The people actually making decisions, not the politicians selling it to the public. Do they really believe this? Is it that there are people in the West saying the truth, but actual decision makers are ignoring it? I tend to believe they do understand it. And again, their goal was never to help Ukraine. It was just to keep this going for as long as possible, raise the cost as high as possible for Russia.
Yeah, I mean, that's what Josh Rogan was saying in the Washington Post op-ed, this resident neocon. He was saying that it's a trap to get into negotiations with Russia because that helps Russia recover, and Russia's doing so poorly. We need to up the aggression. But really what they're saying is that Russia needs to continue to fight this war. We need to continue to supply it because that is what we want to do. We want to destroy Russia. But the interesting thing, though, Brian, that I wanted to get your take on is back in December 2024, the very end, there was an op-ed in The Hill, and it was from a diplomat who said that he was a so-called U.S. diplomat. He said that he was in at a think tank conference. He didn't name which one it was, but there were senior Ukrainian officials and senior U.S. officials, and they were talking about how in April of 2024, Ukraine's military was in such a dire situation that it was probably best that they stopped fighting. And what ended up happening was that they went on fighting anyway, which seems to me to indicate exactly what you said, that they know this, but they're selling something different. Your take?
Yes, absolutely. I really do think that that's what's going on. And again, I hate to just keep bringing it up over and over again, but the Rand Corporation put out that 2019 paper titled Extending Russia, and they explained it in excruciating detail. As a matter of fact, every aspect of U.S. foreign policy is spelled out in excruciating detail in these think tank policy papers years in advance. If you just read them, you will know absolutely everything that is going to happen when it begins unfolding a year, 2 years, even sometimes 5 to 10 years afterwards, depending on the timeline. A lot of people say that the collective West doesn't plan beyond four-year political office terms, but that's not true. The think tanks do. That is who's actually running policy, and they think in years, 5 years, 10 years, 20-year blocks. That's how they do it, and many times they're successful in what they're doing. Look at Syria. That was not a failure. They eventually succeeded in hollowing it out, destroying it, and removing it from the region so that they could further isolate Iran. That was the whole point of it. They wrote about that in policy papers years and years and years ago. They did the exact same thing for Iran. They did the exact same thing for Russia. They've also done it for China. So they know this. They cannot come out and tell the public that this is what we're going to do. We're going to take Ukraine. We're going to ram it into Russia at the cost of their collective future. They have no future. We are going to feed Ukraine feet first into the meat grinder of proxy war. And if we do it right, there will be no Ukraine left, and Russia will be severely overextended. And we can then continue finding new proxies and new ways to pressure Russia until it collapses. They can't come out and say that. They have to frame it as if Russia started it, Ukraine is defending, and there's some sort of chance of them succeeding, or else people won't go for it. Unfortunately, people don't apply critical thinking. They don't do analysis. They don't even oftentimes listen to people who are offering it for free. You know, unlike the Washington Post, we don't put anything behind a paywall. I mean, I do. A lot of people don't. And you can get this information. I will show you the policy papers. People are not interested. Emotional narratives, unfortunately, always sell much better than cold hard analysis. People don't want to hear it. They don't want to hear bleak news and information, especially if it requires personal sacrifice and investment from them to change it. They want to believe that they can just go and vote once every 4 years and somehow change everything. It's just not true. And so this is why it continues, even though they have the whole plan out in the open. Like, these policy papers are free on the internet to download. Anyone can read them, but people don't. And I understand why. There's like 100 pages long. It's dry academic English. It's extremely boring. You have to have kind of a basis of understanding just to know what they're talking about.
You have to find them too, right? Like, you are doing meticulous research. They're not often promoted, that although their spokespeople are promoted. So if you're looking up who is talking in the Western mainstream media, you might find CSIS and Rand Corporation folks, but they might not be talking about their reports. But continue.
Yes, no, absolutely. So I guess yes, this is why we have people like van der Leyen saying these narratives, knowing that it's not true. They're not dumb. They know it's not. Well, maybe she thinks it's true, but the people telling her what to say, they know it's not true, because these are the people I got all the information from to confirm my analysis in the first place. So yes, that's the unfortunate reality. That they're not trying to save Ukraine. And when we're talking about peace for Ukraine, or just with Russia, that it's just not in the cards. It's not part of the plan. So there's no one that's going to genuinely pursue that. Certainly not incoming President Trump. He's not going to pursue that. The people he's surrounded himself with are people who have been on board with this agenda throughout their entire political career. There's no way they're going to be. This is all theater. It's all about public perception management.
I wanted to, as you were speaking, it made me think about, Russia's particular strategy, not just in Ukraine, but generally, because we often hear like the DPRK, for example, developing a nuclear bomb, developing a hardcore military because of what they witnessed in Iraq, because of what they witnessed in Libya, because, and you could also throw Syria in there. It seems to me that Russia is attempting to glean similar lessons, maybe in a more favorable position. They saw what happened to Libya. They saw what happened to Syria. And of course, the end game happening maybe far longer than what the US and NATO wanted, but happening nonetheless. And it seems to me that that video that comparing van der Leyen and Mark Rutte, what it really demonstrates is how Russia has been preparing for this for a very long time. So now they not only have the most nuclear weapons in the world, they also have the Oreshnik, which might outmode nuclear weapons if used correctly in a certain kind of way. And they've also fought the Ukraine war in a particular kind of way to protect themselves, so that, as you were talking, Brian, earlier, there's so many other peripheries, so many other arenas. Russia has to be able to be vigilant against those if it's going to survive and live. So that was what I was thinking about as you were talking. What do you make of this kind of a strategy, maybe a bigger strategy of Vladimir Putin's leadership? And I think we have to actually credit a lot of this, not just to him, but the leadership of him and those around him in moving in this kind of direction.
Yeah, so it's big. It's a big picture foreign policy. So every time Russia does something in Ukraine, it has to think of how it's going to impact absolutely everything else that it's doing, everything else that's in the middle of. So a lot of people emotionally, and again, it's understandable. A lot of people followed the conflict in Syria since it began in 2011. Some people even before that, because it's not as if that's when the U.S. began targeting Syria. It's targeted Syria throughout its existence as a modern nation state. People were very upset that Russia wasn't able to defend Syria, wasn't able to do more to support Syria. You see a blame game going on between supporters of Syria, supporters of Russia, blaming the other for giving up or cutting some kind of secret deal. And in reality, it was just that Russia is spread thin, plain and simple. They are heavily invested in Ukraine, and they do not have the additional resources to fight a conflict on that scale in Syria, as well as everything else you just mentioned, Danny, all of these other situations and potential threats along its periphery. We have to remember the U.S. tried to overthrow Belarus multiple occasions, including in recent years, and they're still trying, even to this day, right now. We saw the political chaos in Georgia. We have to remember in 2003, the U.S. did successfully overthrow the government in Georgia. They put a pro-U.S., pro-NATO client regime into power. They began militarizing the country into a battering ram against Russia. And in 2008, according to an EU investigation, Georgia struck at Russian peacekeepers, first precipitating the 2008 war. And Russia, like you say, Danny, they took not just lessons away from other nations being targeted and destroyed by the U.S. and its proxies. They also took lessons away from what the U.S. has done directly to them. Remember, the conflict in Chechnya was also one of these proxy wars the U.S. was waging inside Russian borders for years and years and years, a devastating, actually 2 conflicts back to back. And so they understood the threat, a infiltrated, politically captured Ukraine being militarized, being NATOized, de facto NATOized, right on its border. They understood the very real threat, not just to national security, but their own self-preservation. They had to act, and they did act, and they have prioritized that higher than Syria. They're involved in Syria because they understand if Syria falls, it'll further isolate Iran. If Iran falls, this is going to further isolate Russia and, I would say, China in a much more global sense. So it's not as if they're not interested in Syria, but they've prioritized Ukraine first. This is how they think about foreign policy. They have to prioritize. They have to make hard decisions. They cannot be everywhere all the time. And so hard decisions have to be made. And they're thinking long term. So they're saying, Syria is lost today, but that's not permanent. When conditions are favorable, maybe we can do something about this in the future. It makes no sense to irrationally invest in a conflict you cannot win while you're already tied in basically a war with NATO in Ukraine, right on your border.
Yeah, and I don't even believe it's a lack of, because I've heard people say Russia, China, Iran, they kind of lack almost like a solidarity, like a kinship, a desire to defend those who may be weaker and unable to. I don't actually see it that. I mean, there are so many examples of why that's just absolutely ridiculous when you consider what Russia's done for the people of the Donbass, what Iran has done for the resistance all across West Asia, what China's done in its economic terms to help poorer countries develop with fair trade deals. But I think it's about the fact that Russia knows, when you listen to Mark Rutte, when you listen to Ursula von der Leyen, they don't care if the board is destroyed. They are at the point where they believe the self-preservation of an empire and the riches that come from it could very well most possibly be secured by destroying the whole board, the chessboard, or the Brzezinski's grand chessboard. No. Just wipe it all away. Like that is where NATO and the United States at its head is going. And I believe that's why there is this caution, there's this care, because it's not about, are we weaker than you? Can we not Oreshnik you? Can we not nuke you? No, you could. But then what happens thereafter?
No, that's very well put, Danny. Think about it like a game board, not to trivialize it, but it's a good analogy for people to visualize. It is a game board. It is a game. They're losing the game. From their point of view, flipping it over so that at least they don't lose. From their point of view, that is a better outcome than actually just outright losing. And like I said before, they feel like if they turn everything over, destroy everything, they feel like they'll be in a better position to rebuild and reassert themselves than the rest of the world that they're going to destroy. This is what China is dealing with its island province of Taiwan. They understand that the U.S. they're not defending the client regime on Taiwan. That client regime is a pile of dynamite with a fuse that they want to light and blow the whole island province up with. That's what that is, just like they've done in Ukraine. They understand that. And so they're doing everything in their power to avoid a conflict because they don't want Taiwan destroyed. They have no intention they don't want to destroy Taiwan. But the U.S. is going to do everything in its power to provoke a war. And if they can't provoke China into the war, they will start the war themselves. You watch. They will do it when they feel like they're totally out of time. They will go ahead and they will try to do that, just like they've done in the region, Syria, Iran, Yemen, even North Africa, also in Eastern Europe. And think about it too. I was so, again, I say this often, I was so sure before 2022 that Europe was going to pivot toward Russia, toward China. There were all the signs. They were literally building infrastructure together. Europe was talking to China about Belt and Road Initiative infrastructure. The Nord Stream 2 pipeline was being built. It was so obvious that their interests were served by pivoting eastward away from the United States. And yet they went along with it anyway. Why is that? Again, it all comes back down to the political capture of these countries on the level of the government, but also capture of these nations' information space by the U.S., by the interests that control the U.S., and their ability to convince people in these countries that working together with Russia and China somehow is not in their best interest. Going to war with them is sacrificing your economy, cheap energy, competitiveness in terms of industry. Giving all of that up is worth it to fight these evil Asiatic hordes to the east. They have convinced people of this, and you can see how it's leading them all off a cliff, and they're all in line going over the cliff. It's sad to see, but that's how human nature works, and this is what they've succeeded in doing, unfortunately.
Yeah. And in that op-ed I was talking about from the diplomat, I think his name was Joseph Durso. He, when he was talking about how it was quite clear that U.S. officials, the United States, knew Ukraine's military is in such a position that it's not only not going to win, but that moving forward is an absolute disaster. And actually, the conversation was moving toward unconventional warfare or asymmetric warfare, which we've seen against Russia, terrorist attacks, all of this. But I wanted to talk about that in the context of this more full picture of a multipolar world, because you have Russia cementing a strategic partnership with Iran. You have Indonesia joining BRICS. You have China also. I don't know if you saw, Brian, this huge amphibious assault ship, this incredible, what might be a 6th generation jet. We don't actually know. China hasn't come out forward and said this is a 6th generation fighter jet, but we know that they have formidable air power, formidable naval power. It seems like the multipolar world is, and then we can throw Russia and what it's doing in Ukraine and how it's handled that conflict, is preparing for this game board to be the grand chessboard that Brzezinski was talking about, knocking all the pieces down. It's the empire wants to wipe a clean slate. Seems like they're preparing this. Could you talk about this idea of asymmetric warfare, though, because I think it spans. It spans the military front. I would definitely want you to talk about that, but it also spans very many other kind of fronts that don't get much attention.
This is a very good question, and I actually just my most recent article and video is actually about this, about China's growing military might, and we can throw in Russia's immense military power, its military industrial base. We can see how powerful it is. We can see the growing mismatch between these emerging powers and the collective West, which for generations held a superiority in terms of military and economic power. And I was actually talking about the new amphibious assault ship, Type 076, how they built it in such a short. They proposed it, designed it, and built it so much faster than any US ship could be built of similar specifications. How China is building so many more ships every year than the US, the way the US admits they'll never catch up with China. And they even say themselves that they need to use asymmetrical methods to continue trying to reassert supremacy over China and the rest of the world. The thing that I've said consistently all throughout this discussion, and the point that I made in the article and video, is that yes, China has this huge and growing military. They have a huge advantage in terms of missiles. If the US were to start a head-on conflict with China in Asia, it would be a disaster for the US. I'm not even sure how they could end up doing it without eventually using nuclear weapons, and that itself being a huge disaster and risk and catastrophe. But they really don't have the military power to take on China head on. So what are they doing? What is their plan? Their plan is not to go head to head with China. They've got their US Navy and Air Force around the South China Sea to cut off Chinese maritime shipping there, to complicate it, to threaten it, to create a conflict, not necessarily to win, but to hinder Chinese economic activity worldwide, Chinese trade worldwide. We just heard incoming President Trump talk about the Panama Canal, and he even specifically was talking about doing this in reference to China because it is an essential choke point if you want to cut off Chinese maritime shipping worldwide. They are preparing to do this. And it's not Trump's idea. It is the idea that all administrations have been preparing for over the years. The Biden administration over the last 4 years transformed the entire US Marine Corps from being basically an expeditionary force that could do anything anywhere at any time. Now they are solely focused on interdicting maritime shipping in Asia Pacific. That's their only job now. And they've been giving the weapons and reorganized their structure, which is unprecedented in terms of the US military. They've never reorganized a branch of the military so extensively, so quickly. And that is, again, to interdict Chinese maritime shipping, say in the Strait of Malacca or in and around the South China Sea or elsewhere in Asia Pacific. They are in the Middle East. The US is in the Middle East. And again, that is to complicate the export of hydrocarbons to China. And they could also use that military presence there to just interdict maritime shipping going through, say, the Suez Canal, for example. So you see them setting up a strategy where they're not actually right there off China's coast fighting China head on. They're right beyond the reach of China's military. Even though they always claim that China is this big military risk to the entire world, they admit in their policy papers that China does not have the ability to project military power worldwide. People were wondering, why didn't they send troops to Syria to save Syria? They cannot. They don't have the ability to send troops and sustain combat operations that far from their own territory. So the US is taking advantage of that. China is building the Belt and Road Initiative specifically to circumvent a possible maritime blockade by the US. They understand this threat. So they began building the Belt and Road Initiative. So they have entire economic corridors, say, through Pakistan, through Myanmar, so that when hydrocarbons, for example, are coming back from West Asia, they go to a port in Myanmar, and then it's sent by pipeline straight to China instead of having to go through the Strait of Malacca and the South China Sea. So what has the US been doing over the last 10, 20 years almost? They've been backing armed militant groups, opposition groups, to physically, literally attack this Belt and Road Initiative infrastructure. In Pakistan, they attack and kill Chinese engineers. They attack the infrastructure itself. They even tried to kill the Chinese ambassador to Pakistan in like the last 2 or 3 years. That was very recent. In Myanmar, the US is backing an entire armed insurrection inside Myanmar to overthrow the Chinese-friendly government and put a Zelensky Ukraine-style client regime into power there that will irrationally turn itself against China right on Myanmar's border. They're also attacking pipelines and other Chinese projects and investments in Myanmar. Even here in Thailand, where I'm based, the US is backing an opposition movement that has been gaining momentum and influence and power inside the government. And they are openly anti-China. And they have even come out and said the ongoing high-speed rail project that is already being constructed, that should be abandoned. And Thailand should develop Hyperloop technology, which doesn't even exist. I mean, it's completely defunct at this point. The point is, that's what the US is doing. They're not going to go into a head-on conflict with China. They're going to use proxies. They're going to cut maritime shipping. They're going to use terrorism and subversion worldwide to complicate China's attempts to trade and develop with the rest of the world. Danny, I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. Yeah, no doubt. Everything you said is happening already. I mean, it's happening already. And what's so, I think, important about this is if we were to take, like, even when we were looked at, let's look at the leaders in the multipolar world right now in each of their respective spheres, I guess you call it spheres of influence, just in Eurasia alone: Russia, China, and Iran. Iran has shown that they have military capabilities. I mean, there's a lot of talk about, oh, did Israel knock them out during that strike? I think it was late October. Very unlikely, given that they just put out a huge military exercise on video where they definitely have military capabilities that would be very useful in a head-on war. Russia, China, we know what they have, and we know there's a reason why the United States is not trying to initiate a head-on war right away. But the hope, it seems to me to be, is that if you can create a scenario, a global context of chaos, then these countries will eventually crumble. I mean, even Syria, even the Syrian Arab army, which didn't have a ton of fighting experience, it did need Russia's assistance, yes. But even they were able to, for a significant period of time, to fend off the proxy war, the dirty war that the United States was leading against it with all of its vassals. But over time, there was, of course, the erosion of Syria is just in a very, very disadvantageous location, and the sanctions absolutely decimated Syria. But Russia and China, of course, and even Iran are a bit different. Still, though, it seems like that's the overall strategy. Is it's almost like an attritional war against multipolarity, except that it seems to me that the empire doesn't want. It's not like Russia choosing Russia is choosing attrition. The United States empire would much rather get this done as quickly as possible.
I don't know, maybe. I mean, if you look at the National Endowment for Democracy created in the 1980s, I mean, the creation of this organization reflects a very long-term approach to politically capturing one nation after the other. You could see on that hand. So they're thinking long-term, but on the other hand, I think they're running out of time and they're trying to speed things up. The Arab Spring, for example, this was engineered by the US years in advance. They were preparing for this specifically. And when the conditions were right, they launched it. And what they were trying to do is sweep across the entire region because they're behind schedule. They understand. And Danny, you've been to China and you've seen it. And it's hard to explain to people that haven't been there and haven't seen it, the scale everything is at. And not just how big everything is, but how quickly it's moving, it's developing, and it's not linear, it's exponential. It's just happening faster and faster every single year. The US understands this. So they have their specific economic and political system that they're using to try to dominate the planet. And it is entirely different than the industry, infrastructure, national interest-based approach China has, for example, and Russia also to a great extent. And they understand that in the long term, China is going to have the advantage. No matter what the US does, they're not going to succeed. So this comes back to this conversation that we are having about the US just flipping the board over with global conflict, a global economic blockade. You already see them testing the waters with trying to stop the shipment of Russian hydrocarbons. This is what they're getting prepared for. It was being prepared from Obama to all under Trump, all under Biden, and now Trump is eagerly taking the baton and ready to run another 4 years with this agenda. And we're going to see it accelerate dangerously.
Yes.
Just one last thing I want to say, it's that nations need to protect their information space. We're seeing the United States very openly talk about banning TikTok, and they even have the in Congress, they have the Protecting Americans from Foreign Adversary Controlled Applications Act. Like, this is exactly what the U.S. has been doing with Twitter, now X. Make no mistake, Elon Musk is part of the government. He's using X to advance US foreign policy.
He is literally now a part of the government.
He's
yes.
Literally. I mean, it's such a joke. Google, YouTube, Facebook, Meta, whatever it's calling itself these days, this is what they've been doing since the advent of social media. This is what they've been using it for. Now they're openly banning it inside the United States. China and Russia very wisely banned US-based social media platforms from their information space, but the rest of the world has not. Here in Thailand, it is dominated by US-based social media platforms. The US controls every aspect of the flow of information, the narratives, and people's personal identities here in Thailand, instead of Thai people having any sort of influence over this themselves. It is very scary. It's very destructive. It really does make a difference. And it's a threat that a lot of people don't even really recognize, or they think it's benign. They just, oh, it's Facebook. People are sharing cat pictures on there. No big deal. No need to pass any laws. But you could see the US is doing it. This would be a great time for BRICS together collectively. They really don't do things like this collectively, but it would be a good idea to start talking about securing information space in the 21st century, the same way nations secure their land borders, shores, and airspace.
Well, China seems to me to be in the driver's seat on this. I mean, your example of TikTok is very interesting, given how Xiaohongshu, the Little Red Book app, is now becoming a hit in the United States because of all these TikTok refugees, they're calling themselves, leaving TikTok for this Chinese app. But what it underscores is that China has its own indigenous tech sector. It has developed its own US free. There's no Google. None of their cables are running through WeChat or Xiaohongshu or Douyin or anything like that. It's theirs, and that, I think, is going to be critically important. There's a lot of criticism, of course, of China's Great Firewall, but without the Great Firewall, we wouldn't have a China with all of this independent technology. So that, yes, it's information space. People, it's not, a lot of people criticize China and Russia and Iran and others too, but I think China even the most because of its economic situation, how prosperous it is. They criticize it for not being able to get the message out effectively to the collective West. But what they've done, in effect, is they have kept their media very protected from what they found out in. They scoured the WikiLeaks documents. They're one of their tech firms, Chihu 360, scoured WikiLeaks documents and found that in Vault 7, it was the CIA trying to take everything from China, from personal data to aviation, oil sector, anything from China they could, in order to wage this, asymmetric warfare. So, I think you're exactly right, Brian, that the multipolar world as a whole, and I think China is going to have to be, it's one of the few countries that's been able to practice this domestically, is going to have to figure out how to do this. How do you make an independent sphere of information? And that's going to take, a lot of work, given the still there's unity on development, economic development, prosperity, and even peace in many respects. But on these kind of questions, there's so many differences, of course, between each member country and whatnot.
Well, one point I always try to make is, Russia and China both provide partner nations with the means to defend their physical national security domains. They sell them warplanes to protect their airspace, ships to protect their shores, tanks and firearms to protect their land borders. Why not create exports that help nations protect their information space here in the 21st century, where it really is part of a nation's national security. You could see what is the impact of not controlling your information space. Ukraine, the US comes in. It's not just the information space, though. It's academic, political space, the legal system. The US, through the NED, targets all of it, absolutely all of it, very deliberately, to compromise and capture it, and then turn it against the targeted nation itself, the government and the circles of interest that run that particular country. And so people have to understand that is how it works, and they need to, in the 21st century, defend against this infiltration. And like you say, Danny, your information space should be like what is inside your land borders, and who is developing that. You and your country are developing that. Why wouldn't you also be in control of and developing your information space as well? And I think the problem is, you talk to a lot of, let's just face it, a lot of governments are run by older people who really don't have a good grip on the internet, information technology, and they kind of really don't get it. They just think it's something people send messages with. They don't understand the implications. And again, like I said, a lot of them get their information from the collective West, and they're not going to read an article about how Facebook, or they'll read an article about how Facebook played a role in overthrowing, say, the government in Egypt in 2011, but they won't put it together and understand the national security threat it actually represents. So this is a huge problem. And like I said, China and Russia could start talking about it. They could start putting options together to export to nations. A lot of it does come down to, though, convincing people this is a problem in the first place. There's another problem to consider also. If a nation starts talking, and remember when China began banning Facebook and Google, because these were being used deliberately to help fuel literal terrorism in Xinjiang, China. Remember the firestorm, the media firestorm the West lit when that was happening, how they were condemning and smearing China and depicting it as a totalitarian society, censoring everything, when in reality, it was the collective West using social media to spur on deliberate terrorism and separatism in Xinjiang that was killing people, brutally killing people. So this is a hard fight. I think this more than anything, because I always say you could have a huge military, a formidable military, cutting edge technology, tanks, missiles, but people are the most important component of any nation. And if you don't have control or influence over your people, or if your people aren't unified behind the purpose of national interests and instead have been compromised and captured by foreign influence, those people aren't going to get into the tanks. Or if they do, they're going to point the gun in the wrong direction. They're going to point it at your direction. You're going to wake up one day, you won't have a nation. It'll be stolen out from under you. U.S. has done it on a number of occasions.
Syria. I mean, literally, what you just said right there made me think, ding, 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 Syria. We're going to find out, Brian, in my opinion. This is my opinion. It's speculation. We don't have evidence, but we do have history as evidence. We're going to find that over the years that we weren't able to pay attention to Syria, especially the last year plus, where there's been genocide, regional war, conflagration all over West Asia, excluding Syria for the most part. At least on the military front, even though Israel was bombing Syria throughout this whole period. We're going to find, I think, that what that had happened was exactly what you just said, which is the government internally, especially the military, was compromised because of this intense pressure, not only from sanctions, but the sanctions kind of form a base, but also from the fact that you've just been through a war and the country could not be rebuilt. And then you also had still the forces that were trying to overthrow Syria kinetically, through dirty war. They were doing it still just out of sight, out of mind. In my opinion, I have never seen, I don't know if you've ever seen this, Brian, just armed groups, the same armed groups that were trying to destroy your nation from 2011 to 2016, 17, 18, walking in, and then suddenly the commanders, they're just putting down their weapons and they're saying, okay. In my opinion, that means that there had been a serious compromising of the Syrian government, and that is what I think, and that's a model that's existed throughout history for the empire. How many coups, how many indirect wars has the United States fought, and its so-called allies have fought dozens upon dozens. We can't even name. We wouldn't be able to sit here and name them all without taking another several hours to do so. So that to me seems to be what happened to Syria. From if you just look at it from you're just looking and the history. That's just how it looked.
No, you're definitely right that it was an admitted factor all throughout the attempted U.S. Regime change operation. We remember Google talking directly to Hillary Clinton in her capacity as Secretary of State at the time, talking about developing all kinds of apps and manipulating the information space in Syria, again, because they did not have sovereignty over their information space. Google held control over it. And they were creating entire apps to put pressure, to panic the officers, the politicians, everyone into defecting or fleeing. And it's not as if they stopped doing that. They were doing that all the way up until the end, and they were tweaking it, adjusting it. Although I would say probably the biggest factor really was just the way the fighting unfolded on the battlefield. The Syrian army did initially try to fight, and Russia attempted to back them with airstrikes, like relentless airstrikes. The problem was the nature of the fighting. Those forces backed by the US were adapting and adopting new technology and updating their tactics and their strategies.
They had drones. I mean, they had
Yes.
drones. They had all kinds of weapons from Ukraine. Even you had Ukrainians there. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so they were being struck by an enemy they couldn't even see, and there was nothing they could do. It was like Armenia and Azerbaijan. You're just sitting there with all your equipment, and everyone is being blown up and killed, and you don't even know where it's coming from. And so you have two choices: just sit there and wait for your turn, or you flee. And I think that's primarily what happened with the Syrian Arab army. But I'm not going to downplay the impact of U.S. attempts to compromise the command structure and even the morale of the troops themselves. Because I have no idea how Syria has managed its information space. I could tell by their attempt to communicate to the international world through Sana, I think it is. It was horrible. It was It was a complete failure. It was a waste of money. It achieved nothing. It could have been done better by almost anyone. Could have come in and done better. A random blogger could have come in and done a better information operation than that. And so this is why I feel a lot of these countries still to this day, I could tell you here in Thailand, anyone who is interested in Thai sovereignty has missed the boat when it comes to information space and sovereignty over it. They don't get it, and they're not doing anything about it. And this is what is giving this. I mean, I'm telling you, we see Russia and China militarily surpassing the collective West. If they were able to collectively tune in information space, again, this is the 21st century. The internet is a thing now. If they were able to do that, yes, then multipolarism would be inevitable. But at this point, I would almost argue that control over information space still is more significant than any missile Russia could develop and launch, and any ship China could design, build, and put to sea.
Yeah, and from what I've heard from folks in China, this is a serious discussion about, because it's a delicate walk and a tightrope, and I'm sure Russia to some extent also thinks about this, a delicate tightrope between being accused of and having to combat the consequences of being told and accused of interfering in the affairs of other countries, versus how do you promote the message of what China is and what it's doing to the world, and provide information that is an alternative to the U.S. Media and its propaganda war, which is exactly what you're describing. That has a huge impact. That has a huge impact in Syria. It's obvious that it had a huge impact in Syria. It's obvious. Yes. It's quite clear. And it had a huge impact even during the height of the HTS walking into Syria, when we were following the map and following them go from Aleppo down to Homs and onward. We could see that social media was playing a huge Twitter X huge role. It was playing a huge role. The Muslim Brotherhood types, all of these kind of folks were just flooding and
Yes.
and changing people's perceptions, and it's still having an impact based on how I'm seeing a lot of people talk about Syria in a very
Yes.
um dare I say cringy way, like just adopting what we had thought we had thrown out before about Syrian government, Bashar al-Assad, look at the atrocities, all this. It's gone. He's gone. And yet still a lot of people are talking like this and actually saying that that's the primary reason, which blows my mind. Why this happened blows my mind, because it negates everything that happened in the last decade plus.
And I just want to point out that is all happening on X, exactly as it was happening under Twitter, coupled together, admittedly, with the U.S. State Department. And again, because a lot of people, they see Elon Musk as some sort of savior. And I have to admit that, yes, X became more accessible once he bought it and transformed Twitter into X. I was literally banned for life from Twitter. I was never going to be back on Twitter. I'm still banned for life from Facebook or Meta or whatever it's called. So I was able to get my account back on X, but you can still see it being used exactly as Twitter was. It's just inevitable that it's going to roll back around again. What they're trying to do is reassert the sense of credibility that they had, that they lost. They go through these cycles where they just dress everything back up again, put a fresh coat of paint on to just kick the can down the road just a little bit longer, to keep it going a little bit longer before people catch on. And it works. People want to believe Elon Musk is coming to save them. They want to believe Trump is coming to change everything. I can't blame them for wanting to see change. But in reality, these people are not here to help you. In many ways, they're not even helping themselves. They're perpetuating an extremely dangerous, destructive pursuit that endangers everybody's peace, prosperity, and stability here on Earth, including, maybe especially, the collective West's.
Brian, just two quick questions from audience members. The
Sure,
first is from a
sure.
longtime Patreon member. So if you want to support this show, you can do so on Patreon. You get to submit questions. You get priority for these kind of things to our guests. And that helps keep this work sustainable, depending on what YouTube does to people like me and Brian. Here is what Jack had to say. He said, "It seems pretty clear Trump and his handlers' interest in Greenland and making Canada the 51st state of the United States is minerals for Elon Musk and big tech, drilling for oil and gas in the Arctic, and building U.S. and NATO military bases for future attacks on Russia. But what's your take on Trump's interest on the Panama Canal?"
Well, I mentioned that it is an essential choke point for Chinese maritime shipping worldwide.
Oh, Brian, you still there? Seems like Brian has frozen. I'm just gonna remove you from the stage real quick. Maybe you'll come back. But that was a very good question by Jack. I'll give my opinion and my assessment quickly while we wait for Brian to return. While we wind down here on this Wednesday evening. The Panama Canal. I mean, this is a textbook case of the Monroe Doctrine. And of course, the fear mongering about China is very real in the sense of what Brian was saying. And I think Brian has reset. There's maritime interests, and there's also just a broad desire by the United States to get rid of. Yeah, there you are.
Hold on a second.
That's okay. I was just talking about how.
I don't know why I don't do, because this happens from time to time. If I just have my phone with me, I can reconnect to the stream right away. But anyway, what I was saying was it is to interdict Chinese maritime shipping. They're preparing, and this was all being done under the Biden administration as well. They're preparing a worldwide blockade on Chinese maritime shipping. Whether they're going to do it or not, I don't know. But they're setting it up at least to have this kind of pressure on China. Someone said Thai internet. The internet here is actually extremely good when I'm having conversations with my family in America. They have many more issues than I do. I think it's just the way I've got it set up in my office where I'm working. So and I apologize for that. I really do got to get around to fixing that.
No, that's okay. That's all right. That's all right. Well, last question here is from Chanel. Will the U.S. manage to turn Iran into the next Syria?
That is the plan. That's where all of this is leading to. That was the whole purpose of the October 7th Hamas attack into Israel, was to precipitate a regional conflict to first eliminate Syria, which they have now done. With Syria out of the way, and they very deliberately and immediately eradicated Syria's integrated air defense network. That was never going to fall into the hands of their client
And they're
regime.
stealing Syria's weapons right now. I mean, whatever's remains of Syria's weaponry, they're just stealing it. They're just taking it.
Yes, that's all going to the armed groups that they're going to now turn against either Iran itself or Iraq, because Iran has a lot of influence in Iraq for many obvious normal reasons. They share a border together. Why shouldn't Iran have more influence in Iraq than the United States from the other side of the planet? And yet, that's where all of this is headed. And I highly suggest people do this. I know they're not going to, but go to the Brookings Institution's website. They have a 2009 paper titled "Which Path to Persia?" And it is the blueprint for overthrowing the government of Iran. Literally everything that is happening now has been written in that paper, down to using Israel as a scapegoat for all of this. So people who imagine Israel is like the center of the universe, determining everything on planet Earth and beyond, no, they are using Israel just like they're using Ukraine. If Ukraine was able to hang in there for decades like Israel has, since it was deliberately created as a proxy of Western power in the region, Ukraine would look the same way. As a matter of fact, if you use the same logic as people who think Israel is running America, look at how much money the U.S. is giving Ukraine. Obviously, Ukraine has power over the U.S. to compel them to give them all of this money, but obviously they're using them as a proxy. Yes, they're using Israel as a proxy, and that's what they are doing in regards to Iran. A lot of people falling into this narrative, you're actually helping facilitate regime change in Iran by going along with this narrative. It's designed specifically to make people think that.
Yeah, and both to Jack and to Chanel, I mean, for me, my answer to Jack would be everything that you said, and the fact that China's presence in Latin America and the African continent, I think the United States has given up on the African continent for many different reasons, not only because it can't compete economically, but also it's just geographically really difficult for the United States beyond military capacity to assert anything on the African continent. Like the amount of work it would take politically, diplomatically, and economically to develop robust ties. They never did it even during the Cold War. The United States wanted to. They tried to stage many coups. The CIA supports so many different groups. But then the level of underdevelopment, I think they just were like, no, we can't do this. It's not the time. We got to go to the Middle East. We got to go here. Now it's Russia and China. So I think they've mostly given up the African continent, other than trying to, which is what they've done, which create this huge military apparatus on the African continent. But that's all. I think that's all the United States will ever focus on with Africa. They don't care about the industry there. They don't care about making money there. Latin America, though, is a different story because of this long-standing history, the Monroe Doctrine, seeing it as the backyard. It seems to me that China's economic activity there is even more a problem for the United States, because on both an economic level and a political level, like this idea that China will be literally south of you conducting economic development, which by far surpasses anything you could do, is just unacceptable. And so the Panama Canal is such a focal point of that, because it just demonstrates how much that countries in Latin America prefer. Doesn't even matter what politically, of course, Venezuela, countries like that, far more amenable to trading with China and aligning with China. But it doesn't even matter. It could be any one of these countries, from the farthest right to the farthest left. They're all looking at China as an alternative. And then for Syria and for Iran, I don't know, but I actually don't believe. I think I think Russia and Iran are very similar in the sense that they do, even if there's political turmoil internally, I think that there is this broader capacity in this now experience. Like Russia has now a little bit of experience, but Iran has like 40 years of experience of dealing with economic warfare to a high degree. Also now has these military capabilities. I think it's going to be so much more difficult to erode Iran's internal stability, but it just can't go on forever and ever. There's going to have to be, of course, it's not going to, it can't be this linear process of, well, things are just going to go on as they've been going on. There's obviously going to have to be bigger moves made by all of these rising powers in the multipolar world to ensure that, even if it's not going to be Syria, which happened in about 10, 15, whatever so years, even if it's 20, 30, 40 years down the road, it still means that you've got to build that alternative path as soon as possible and as robustly as possible. Brian, do you have any final words though? Because we're going to head out of here soon. Any final words that you want to, any thoughts?
Sure. Just on Iran, I think Iran and many other nations that are kind of hanging in the balance right now, I would even include all of Southeast Asia. It really does come down to who can achieve their particular process faster. Can the US poison, manipulate, influence, divide, and destroy these nations faster than nations like China and Russia can build them up, help them defend themselves? That is the question. Unfortunately, just the laws of physics, it's always easier to destroy than to build. So this gives the advantage to the United States, and we've seen them enjoy this advantage on many occasions. But we do see things changing in a positive way. People ask me about the situation here in Thailand often, and I would say it's teetering. You see Southeast Asia entering into BRICS, but we know that that's not irreversible. Remember Argentina? I'm pretty sure they were supposed to go into BRICS. The U.S. got their little proxy clown in power there and just immediately reversed it. And this can happen to any country here in Southeast Asia. Until Southeast Asia, as ASEAN, as a collective organization, and as individual nations who prioritize national sovereignty over everything else, until they get together and say, look, there is a serious threat to all of our collective sovereignty, our individual, collective, regional sovereignty, and that is the U.S. It's invasive manipulation and interference into our internal political affairs. U.S. NED has programs, hundreds of programs in every single country here in Southeast Asia. Until they uproot that, they're never going to actually have control over their future. And that includes their ability to freely associate with those who are actually going to offer them a better future, which includes especially China. And so this is where the battle lines lie. And I hope that our work together and many others out there doing excellent work, I hope we can continue raising awareness, help people see through the political rhetoric, the political theater, especially with the changing of administration, see through the theater, see the continuity of agenda, understand the real special interests driving it. And one thing for people to do other than supporting alternative media, which I think is a huge step and helps a lot, think about how you personally can invest in multipolarism, divest from US-led hegemony. And that includes the corporations listed on Wall Street that are driving all of these policy decisions. And finally, just thank you, Danny, for having me on. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in and listening.
Yeah. And it's certainly a lot falls on us. We talk a lot about what other countries can do, what multipolar world can do. We have a lot we need to do to ensure that this multipolar world can flourish. Everybody, this will be a monthly program, so be on the lookout for when the next one is. You can find Brian Berletic's information from his Telegram to his YouTube channel in the video description. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thanks to everyone who gave a super chat. There's Timothy, there's Scribe, there's Eddie Tours, and of course we had Chanel's question. When you leave this stream, be sure that you have hit the like button, because that will help boost this stream in the algorithm from here on forward. So there's about 3,800 of you. If you all can go and hit the like button before you leave here, you can get 3,800 likes to this video. It will help it maintain course so more people can see it well after we have departed. With all that said, everybody, take good care. I will be back probably. We have some streams set up for the inauguration, post-inauguration period. So keep a lookout for that, and take care. Have a good night. Bye-bye.